chose this title, obviously it's a reference to the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And perhaps the whole lecture is about why this is indeed a curse from one specific case, that of my own generation, known unhappily, I think, as the generation of Polytechneio. It refers to the time of the junta, of course, the dictatorship, and perhaps I'm talking about very interesting times, in some way extreme, as the times are of political anomaly. I'm saying these are a writer's reflections, but it's not the obvious fact that I'm a writer and I reflect, you know. Writers are sometimes, like all people, known to reflect. It's really a writer reflecting about writing and about things that have to do with writing. It is interesting to you, I found it interesting, usually to people to hear writers speak also about the writing, but rather than speak about my writing in itself, which is not always a very interesting exercise to people, I thought I would use part of my experience as a writer, and especially my efforts to write one particular book. It was a play, really. Failed attempts, the play was never written. I will use those attempts as a spine for my talk. And so I will share with you some of the stages I went through trying to write this unwritten, never written play. Because I think it is, as you will see, it is an interesting way to approach my subject. Now, I was born in 1953. I was 14 when the dictatorship started, 21 when it finished. But I was quite involved as a student with what's known as, rightly or wrongly, the resistance against it. And for years after the dictatorship, the first years, especially when I began more seriously to write in the late 70s, there was frequently in my papers a note of two letters, those two letters, me, he, or X in English. Most Greeks would say this is Meta Christon, after Christ, Anno Domini, usually written with a small m. This was a capital M. This was my code name to myself for this play that I had started to think about, which I called as a working title, to myself, notes to myself, endless notes to myself that you would find all over my drawers. We didn't have computers then, papers, shelves, desks. There were little papers saying, mihi this, mihi that, mihi a note. And to me it meant meta ti junta, or meta juntas, I referred. Now we call it metapolitevsi, the times after the junta, where a new polity, a new political institution was formed, the state of the country. But to me it was meta junta, what happens after the junta. This play, and I will assume that it is something already in my mind and more will come out about it as I proceed, was roughly to have the following structure. It would be in two parts. There was in the bipartite structure, not the usual 3 or 5 or 4 act structure, 2-part structure, which is a more modern structure of a play. The first part was roughly about the dictatorship and something called the resistance, and then this second part was roughly about democracy, the times after the dictatorship. At the end of part 1, I knew, before I even started, I knew of only one scene at the end of part 1, before the break. And this was a sort of explosion of joy, of happiness in people of my generation, which occurred on the 23rd of July 1974, the night when the junta, afternoon and evening, when the junta collapsed. There's no better word for it. And people went out in the streets of Athens rejoicing. I was there. It was there was a climate in that evening that was difficult for us to forget, for those of us who lived through it, of extreme joy, hope and expectation. I thought from the start that this moment would be crucial to my play. I didn't know much more about it, but I knew that this would be the point separating the two. That evening of celebrations, where I walked around Athens, was to me a very particular evening for one rather unusual reason, not so much for the joy itself and the extraordinary sense of hope and sudden possibility that was there. But more so because when I returned home after it, it was a period which was difficult for me for all sorts of personal reasons which are not interesting here. But it was a difficult period for me personally. When I returned home, when I sat down alone, I realized with horror, I might say, that all my problems, my personal problems, were still there. And to me that evening, the extreme joy, and then suddenly the blues that came over, a whole generation really, and to me again in my private code, and I've heard it discussed by others in that or similar terms, was the post-junta blues. And those post-junta blues would spur me on from the first act onto the second. For those who don't know, the younger or the non-Greek, I don't think there are too many of those here tonight, but for the younger, a brief reminder of the timeline. April 21st, 67, there's a coup d'etat, group of army officers takes over the government, begins to rule through fear and repression and torture. Democracy is abolished. Then, November 73, there is the Polytechneio, a student rising which ends in blood, and about 20 or a few more people are killed, and some hundreds, or that many, around 100 are wounded. And then, summer of 74, there is democracy, democracy is restored. With this idea of the play, I saw a performance. I read actually about this play, a play showing in London. I was in London at the time for a journey, for a brief trip. I went to the National Theatre where a play by David Hare, not the Sir David Hare of today, but a very young, rather angry playwright of the second angry generation, not the generation of the 50s with Osborne and so on, but the generation of the 70s, David Hare, Howard Barker, Howard Brenton, people like that, Snu Wilson, called Plenty. And I went to see that play at the National Theatre. I had read about it something that I found extraordinary, that it had sort of the same kind of idea as my play, that it was about the occupation, the German occupation of Europe, a young British woman working with the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, involved in resistance in Europe, and then her post-war experience. The structure of that play was rather dissimilar to the one I had imagined, but the basic ingredients were still there. Again, there is occupation instead of dictatorship. Again, there is resistance, but it's very little. It's just one scene at the beginning. Then there's liberty, 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 the times after the war. And at the end, the same explosive moment of liberation, which in my play to be, would be in the middle, is at the end. And that was a very interesting structural thing, that in fact, this is a flashback. The play ends with a flashback, which sets in relief all the previous action. Extreme joy, then fear, terror, the start of liberty, not the start, but the progress in liberty down to the bottom of depression, even below perhaps the blue line, and then suddenly a peak of hope at the moment of liberation. That explosive red moment was the same moment I had found interesting in my own experience, the moment of change, the moment where suddenly the war ends and France is free, because she was stationed in France, this young English woman. There's this extraordinary Canadian actress, Kate Nelligan, not much heard of after that, who gave a really electrifying performance of Susan, the protagonist. And in the last scene of the play, the last line of the play, in fact, it's a line that has been voted the second best last line of a work of fiction, you know, those stupid polls like that and lists. Somewhere I found that a huge collection of critics and literary people voted it the second best last line of any work of fiction in the 20th century. I find it extreme. The line was, there will be days and days and days like this. And the reason why this line was so extraordinary to its fans was that because, of course, it throws light on what she had dreamed at the beginning, what didn't happen in between. There weren't days and days and days like this. But it comes at a very, very apt moment, and indeed it is a very strong moment. Now, the structure of the play I was imagining was a bit different. It would be more or less like this. We'd have the dictatorship, there would be ups and downs, and a very low point during the dictatorship. One of my characters was arrested and tortured. Then, let me make a point here. You see this curve that goes up. As I see, there are no mathematicians perhaps, but some computer scientists in here, which is second best to mathematician, they might call it a singularity. There's a sort of curve that at one point goes to infinity and then somehow magically comes down again. But there was this sense of an infinite hope at that moment. And again, in my play, this singularity, and I have it on purpose going outside the frame, came at the middle of the play. And then again, democracy, the main protagonist goes down, down, down. Here already there is a question. I'm begging a question. Why are you comparing? Why was the experience of the occupation interesting to you vis-a-vis the experience of the junta? What do they have in common? Are they the same thing? Why did the play about the occupation remind you of a play you wanted to write about the junta? This was, I have something to say on this, because during the junta I often got quite angry with friends who compared the junta to the occupation, and our generation's plight with that of the occupation. I already found that very extreme. And here's why. There were similarities, of course. Lack of freedom exists in both the occupation and the junta. Resistance is punished both at the time of the occupation and the junta, but there are two differences, one less important and one really important. Material discomfort was there in the occupation. Material discomfort is an understatement, of course. There was hunger, there were deaths from hunger, huge material discomfort, poverty and human suffering, and resistance is punished by death. Now that is one mighty difference for people involved in something which we might call resistance, and those were my circles. And I always reminded the people who said, it's like the occupation, we are the new generation of the occupation. I was saying, guys, you know, we may be risking jail, and we were with many of the things we did. We're not risking death. And that, to me, set a very different moral and emotional and moral atmosphere to what we were doing. It didn't make it any less important, perhaps, but I thought we shouldn't be comparing it ourselves to the occupation generation. Still, though, there is something, there was a defining similarity to me. And it is that in both the occupation and the post-68 junta, not the first year, because the first year there was some acceptance in a large degree of the population, the huge majority of the population, and even more so the young, saw the existing external reality as undeniably evil, and the termination of the junta's rule as undeniably good. Both under the occupation and the junta, especially the last years of the junta, the extreme, 99%, I don't know, there are no statistics, but a huge number of the people saw it as a bad thing. You had to be very unlucky. You had to fall on a government agent, on a hafiez, on an informer, to speak in a casual conversation, say, I hate this government, and then to end up having trouble for it. And of course, everyone wished for the liberation, transcending political affiliations, parties, ideologies, and so on. So the way I thought of the play, and I still think of something I'm writing when I'm writing, and that's often a way that a writer explicitly or implicitly thinks when they write, is by asking themselves a question, what will happen if a happily or conventionally married, happily married French lady living in the French provinces in the 19th century suddenly has a lover and finds herself in love? What happens? Madame Bovary happens. So what happens when a young poor student living in St. Petersburg finds that he meets a very hateful person, a moneylender, and thinks that by disposing of her, he might benefit humanity and save the world from a terrible evil. Crime and punishment happens. You know, often a work of narrative literature is inspired by some kind of question within the writer. So, because I had questions that I wanted to answer with my play to myself, not in any logical sense, but in the sense that a storyteller answers question, I asked myself the question I was asking for my play, and here I express it in terms of David Hare's Plenty, because for a very sad reason to me, if my play had been written, I would refer you to my play, but because it hasn't, David Hare's play has been written. Actually, you can also see it on film. I'll speak about the film later. I'll express the question in terms of Hare's play. What is the reason for Susan's breakdown in the post-war world, this downward curve that we see? Okay, so when I saw the play at the National Theatre, here you see Meryl Streep in the role of Susan. That's the film. I couldn't find, sadly, any pictures of Kate Nelligan in the play. So this is a woman sort of joins what you might call the establishment, takes part in a committee. This scene is in a committee for the coronation, 1953, of Queen Elizabeth, preparing the coronation. She refers often to the past, to the occupation. We are fighting for another world. She feels the people around her are nice, what they say, kind, they're able, but I don't see her should have to compromise. There's a lot, constantly she feels she has to compromise. And at some point, 56 comes, an important year in the play, the Suez Canal crisis. She feels that Britain makes a gross blunder, a fool of itself, and one evening at her very posh house, she attacks poor John Gilbert here, playing a diplomat, a British diplomat, speaking of blunders and follies and fiascos, and embarrassing him regarding Britain's failure as she sees it at the Suez crisis. So the first answer I would give, and this is a very young man's answer, not so much, the answer I've read in the play by David Hare was that the world that was created after the war around her was not the one that she had dreamed of fighting for it. And this was the first question driving me to create my play. Now, as I said, I didn't write the play, but I said I won't mention mathematics, but I will once. The great mathematician David Hilbert once was asked why he did not solve the Riemann hypothesis, a very famous problem in mathematics, still unsolved, that being such a great genius, why didn't he attempt to solve the Riemann hypothesis? And he answered, why should I kill the goose that lays the golden egg? Meaning that a very famous problem constantly creates new research in the efforts to solve it, to answer it. And whereas if one solves it, then there are no more great questions. Of course, okay, that was a way of evading, I think, in his case. But in my case, the fact that I did not write the play does not mean that I did not write other things, which were a result of my failure to write the play. And the first thing that happened was a film. Let's call it here the story of the minister. And this, I wrote a script, a film script, which I then directed, and it was my feature film called I Poglia di Adormi. That was 1983. By the way, I consider it, and this is not false modesty, I consider it a rather horrible film. It is, I don't think you can find it anywhere. If you do not, please do not seek it. If you find it, do not see it. If you see it, do not tell me what you thought. The ideas though are in the script. And this is a scene from the film. It's set in a country which is not named. It's obviously Greece, but no place names are used, no dates are used, no names are used. So it is, in a sense, slightly allegorical landscape. And the protagonist is here the minister, played by Yannis Fertis, and his pal, the guy right to his right, as you see, with the bald guy with the glasses, his age, is his best friend, his pal, his private aide, the director of his political office, a very well-known, I won't mention names in modern political life, but a very well-known type of figure. And as you can see already from the dress code, they both come from the generation of Polytechneio, of the resistance. They were both active in the anti-junta resistance. As you can see, quite obvious symbols here from the Rata. You know, the minister is a bit of a dreamer, nice scarf, nice brown coat. The other guy is already dressed like the thug following there, someone out of the Tonton Macoute, Haiti in the 60s, the secret police, dark glasses and sort of shady looking. And to the left of the minister is beautiful actor Yorgos Moschidis, a man from an older generation of politics, who brings, you know, the system, the establishment, I'm using the terms to refer to their mythical content, a sort of puppet player who really begins to play the idealism of the minister into more conventional outlets, and in the end it ends in tragedy, the play ends in tragedy. And at a very superficial level, we would say at a very dumbing down the film, we would say that it's about the disappointment, it's about a man selling his ideals, coming against the system and abandoning his idealism and destroying himself. But again, this man, like Susan in Plenty, is against a system that turns out a reality that turns out quite terribly. And he retains his idealism and is crushed by it, whereas all the others, either from the past or his own body even, have already given in. Now, on that model, it's more on the Plenty model and not what I had been envisioning, and even more so, it focuses on liberty. There's a few tiny references to the past, the dictatorship, the resistance, but this downward slope of liberty. I don't know what I was thinking then and what David Hare was thinking. This, you know, young people sometimes have a thing against liberty and democracy, but then in my play, it actually at the end, very end, goes beyond, down, under the line, and it ends, because it's an allegory and rather in the big of, in the fantasy category, it ends with a dictatorship, a new dictatorship. And the year was 1983. I was more or less reacting to what I considered being very unpopular, the new climate in the 80s, the PASOK government, which I thought as in its many elements which I did not like. It was done at the wrong moment. I still can recall with a shudder the booing that it received at the Salonika Film Festival, the ending of it, when the last scene with the dictatorship unfolded. And obviously, interestingly, it was criticized as an extremely right-wing film, although of course I was relieved, not that it made I found it particularly important, because I wasn't really making a political point, I was making more of an existential point. With great relief, I saw the great then anarchist leader, Yorgos Karabelias, give me a wonderful review in his anarchist magazine. So I thought that was a very interesting change from being accused of being an extreme right-wing director. So, and later I've often seen it referred to by ecologists as a sort of early ecological thing. That's not important though. In terms of my story, if we have this very, very, very elementary and rudimentary plan of what work of narrative fiction and of any kind looks like, there's plot, there's character, there's place and time, and there's ideas. And this film moved very much. It was very strong on plot. It was constructed like a thriller. It was eminently watchable in that sense, and there were ideas, but there wasn't character. The characters were very stereotypical, and the place time was avoided. And in it, there was, the ideas were driving the plot. I wanted to make a point, really, coming from ideas. And I think that is always a disadvantage with a work of art, or usually is a disadvantage. Now, you have to take into account that time plays a part in my narrative. I was growing up. So this was in 1983. In 1985, interestingly, the film of Plenty was made with Meryl Streep in the role of Susan. I still have very fond memories of the performance with Kate Nelligan. I don't think that Meryl Streep gives the depth that Kate Nelligan did. I saw the film with interest. I didn't like it very much, again, sort of having a nostalgia, soft spot for the performance, but interestingly, because I had also grown, 5 years had passed, I saw the story of Plenty differently. I focused on scenes that were already there, of Susan trying desperately to change this environment which she doesn't like, and then suddenly, one day coming to her husband and saying that the best, they have to make changes in their own home, in their lifetime, which is, of course, is a first sign of a breakdown, and she proceeds to change her environment and the world, her private world, in a very literal sense, destroying everything, really having a psychotic, or I think I think at least 2 psychiatrists in the audience, but I'll call it a psychotic crisis, and I will accept corrections later. Here, there was a different emphasis. I saw the same work as about character and ideas, place time entering it a little into it, and plot not being at all important. And I thought that was progress. I thought this play was saying something much more interesting, that, you know, the system is corrupt and everything must change and idealists cannot change it. I thought that was a rather trivial point. You don't need to write a whole play to say that, whether it's right or wrong. So there was a second question. Now it was a young man's. You'll recall the first one was a very young man's answer. This was a young man's answer, that the prospect of creating a new world is terrifying to her, to Susan always, which we might also call, remembering Erich Fromm, the fear of freedom. Or, in different terms, again, 2 psychiatrists in the hall, I'll call it the pleasure principle does not want to surrender to the reality principle. And it is here the pleasure principle of fantasy, of imagination, of a vision that one has of a reality in the future as a utopia, that suddenly comes crashing against the wall of actual reality. And in some characters, this is a breakdown. This led me to a second form. I tried to rewrite after Υπόγεια διαδρομή, after the film, to write again. I was in film at the time, a film or 2, I say, because it's 2 different films, but with an exactly similar theme, the story of the painter or the story of the monk, and none was ever completed. But I'll tell you the story very, very briefly, the story of the painter and the story of the monk, because both are true stories. I will tell them very briefly. I will try to stick to the facts, more or less disguising them slightly, because both people are living, and one was a dear friend, the other is someone I know, and I don't think it's my business to tell their personal stories. Okay, we have the story of the painter, what I call a painter. He isn't a painter in actuality. In my film he would be. We have a small community of Greeks living in Frankfurt, Greek students at the time of the junta, about 5 or 6 friends. They belong to the same political organization, a political group, a communist group, and during the summer of 1973, the cell leader of their group, their boss, their chief, the secretary, whatever, their father figure, has been arrested and is in jail in Greece. And some of them have been exposed. The names of some of them are known. So the Greek students in Frankfurt in the summer of 1974 cannot return to Greece. Since the summer of 73, they cannot return to Greece because they know that the ATESA, the military police, the security, know their names, so they'll be arrested. So they have to stay there. So they spend their time in Frankfurt. Some of them have jobs, some don't. It's just vacation from university, supporting themselves from income from the family or whatever other means. Some have jobs, and they all come together in the evenings, a group of friends. They meet almost every evening in a situation that's very well known to us who have lived through those years as the misery, or of the emigratia, as we would call it, the young leftists. I was partly in this situation myself. And those evenings were alike, endless cigarettes, quite a lot of alcohol, cheap alcohol, late into the night, Ρεμπέτικα, singing Θοδωράκης, Βάρνελης, στην υπόγεια ταβέρνα, είμαστε δυο, είμαστε τρεις, crying, reminiscing, saying, when will we go back, and so on. I have to tell you something which you won't know perhaps, that until a week before the collapse of the junta, all of us thought that the junta would last forever after the Polytechneio. Forever. 10 years, 20 years. There was no foreseeable future for us, and no foreseeable future of returning to Greece, because this thing would last forever. And then this notion of doom that they have lost their homeland forever is with the people there in the political group in Frankfurt. In those evenings, that's why I call them evenings of misery. So suddenly something happens. The 15th of July, there's a botched coup d'etat in Cyprus. The junta of Greece attempts to have coup d'etat in Cyprus. In the morning, it looks like it's successful. Archbishop Makarios has been killed, and everyone in Frankfurt, the friends, call one another, tell one another they are even more heavily depressed. Until that evening, they suddenly turn on Deutsche Welle as a special news bulletin that says that Archbishop Makarios is alive. He has escaped. He is in Paphos in the military camp there, and they hear with a shudder, which I can feel as I recounted to you, its very nasal, unpleasant voice saying, "Λαέ της Κύπρου, λαέ της Ελλάδος, είμαι ζωντανός." And that's an amazing moment, because not only is he alive, not only is it true that the coup has failed and there is hope, but he expressly speaks, the first time ever, against the junta in Athens, accusing it. Η Χούντα της Ελλάδος της Κύπρου απέτυχε. Η Χούντα της Ελλάδος απέτυχε. And to the friends in Frankfurt, this is a signal that something is happening internationally. This is unprecedented. A serious, respected political figure of international repute is accusing the junta of Greece of masterminding a coup d'etat to have him assassinated. Time moves very, very fast. Then there's the great tragedy and the great responsibility of the junta, the invasion, the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, Attila, a few days later. And then, 21st, 22nd of July, it is becoming clear, even to those friends in Frankfurt, that the junta is collapsing. On the 21st, the Undersecretary of State, the American Undersecretary of State, comes to Athens and declares that I have tried to find ministers of the government, but I couldn't find any, and that must mean something. And then on the next day, Henry Kissinger, the great Henry Kissinger, a very evil figure for the Friends in Frankfurt, but still a very powerful man, says, I think that the government of Greece has failed and it must be, practically, he says, it must be replaced. So suddenly, the group of friends in Frankfurt were thinking of themselves mostly because they're in this state of misery. Also the country, of course, saying, could it be true? Could the junta collapse? Can we go back? On the evening of afternoon of the 23rd, friends called them from Athens, telling them, people are out in the streets, the television, the state television, yes, the state television, the government-controlled state television is saying that there's a change of government, there will be a political government sworn in this evening. A few hours later, they learned that Konstantinos Karamanlis is heading it. The composition of the government is announced, the cabinet, and centrist politicians who were in jail are participating in it. So this must be the end. And among the friends now, there's a young man called Christos, who is not sharing the general glee and enjoyment. During those days, he's increasingly agitated. He is saying, how can you believe that? How can you be so naive? How can you believe the American Undersecretary? How can you believe the bourgeois media and the bourgeois station of Deutsche Welle? How can you believe, for God's sake, the arch-fiend, the devil, demon, Kissinger? What does it matter what he says? You are so naive. Sometimes he walks out of their meetings, goes out to walk and to calm himself. And especially on the 23rd, when they say it has happened, the junta has collapsed, He says, "You are idiots, all of you," and walks out. And when later that night they call him at his home to say, "It is true, there's a political amnesty, we can all go back. Even the Communist Party has become against legitimate, outlawed for over 20 years. And they are calling travel agencies to get their tickets for Greece on the same day. The next day he hangs up saying, "You are idiots." Because he lives with a couple of friends, the elders of the team, really old, like almost 30, he has to come back home to sleep, and midnight comes, 1 o'clock comes, 2 o'clock, 3, 4 a.m. he's not back. The couple, they are the only married couple among the others, are very worried. Anyway, at the end they go to sleep, and at some point the bell rings, telephone, they say, "Hey, Christo, yes, what is it?" "No," German voice, "it's the police." "Do you know a Christo so-and-so?" "Yes, could you come round to the station?" They go to the station, and there is Christos, who has been arrested because he knocked on the door of the house of a man he did not know at 3 o'clock in the morning, holding a mop, a cleaning mop, and said to the man, "Your house needs cleaning." The man said, "What are you talking about? Leave me alone." And then he barged in, and when the poor man tried to stop him, hit him, not very seriously, but hit him, and started with his mop cleaning the walls of his house. The man called the police, Christos was arrested. Here the two psychiatrists are correct in saying that this man had a serious psychotic outbreak. And he more or less, I don't know if he ever recovered, I haven't seen him in many years, but the first years he spent in clinics and in the terrible conditions. This always impressed me, the story, when I heard it a few months after the collapse of the junta. And then when I went to Mount Athos, around 85, I saw a monk who had been there for about 10 years, and I realized that he too was involved in the left during the junta, and left in the summer, I knew sometime in 74, when pressed, feeling very embarrassed about it. He confessed that he left Athens to go to Mount Athos and become a monk on the 23rd of July 1974. The confluence of those two events, the painter, the man I call the painter, and the monk who left on that day, was to me such a powerful image of such a powerful embodiment of the fear of freedom that I found it even more powerful than what David Hare had done with it in Plenty. But I did not know, being not an inexperienced writer, to put it into a story. And what would I do with the guy after the junta? So with my failed attempts for a year to write either one of the two scripts, I stopped thinking about the junta, and I said, I'll leave it behind me, let's do something else. And this, I think, is a usual problem that happens when you see sometimes, you know, in a film based on a true story, you say, very interesting. But unless one sticks very closely to the facts, or unless one is ready to be driven by reality, usually when a writer wants to take inspiration on a true story, and if it's a personal story with a personal resonance, it's sometimes almost impossible to escape the strictures of that reality. The personal, the reality, the based on a true story, if it has a personal element, operates really like a magnet, attracting plot, character, ideas so strongly towards the concrete place-time that it is extremely difficult to create, to make a new and important work of art. Of course, great geniuses have done it, and if you're lucky, you can do it. It didn't happen to me, and I realized I should disengage myself from place-time. And I was suddenly in the void, in virgin territory. Okay, I can write whatever I want, I'm done with all that. And I wrote 2 books over the next 3 years that I realized, reading them now, and actually as I was preparing this talk, I realized that they are both, the first one, which is really about the painter or the monk. It is really about the junta and that moment, that explosive moment, though it's set a bit earlier. It's set in the 4th century AD. It's called Vios Parallelos, and it's the story of a monk. And it is really the story of the painter, or the story of the monk. It is a story of idealism crashing against reality. And I think it is, to me, it is the quintessence of that experience. Interestingly, to me, again, my only thing I wrote about the junta itself, which was a novel in '88, was fully about the junta, very consciously about the junta, but again, not about anything having to do with resistance, with things like that. It was set in the world of the conspirators, of the officers, and it was a part farce, tragicomic construction, in a sense a pastiche of Macbeth, and that's Macabethus is the Hellenization of Macbeth, a retelling of Macbeth at the time of the junta. But all its heroes are junta officers. So there was none of the other stuff, and perhaps it was a way to detox myself of the junta by getting in the part of it that we didn't know at all. But still the old themes were there, were in the past. David Hare's Susan, in a much more interesting to me incarnation, was there. And that came from the past to me, that image. And when I forgot those two books and they were over, I could not forget the story of my parents. Here at the Albanian front, newlyweds, my father as an artillery corporal, my mother as a volunteer nurse of the Red Cross serving on the front. About that time, a little later, after Macabethus, my father was not alive anymore. My mother turned 80, and on her 80th birthday, I asked her, she was very well, she was very healthy and very well. I asked her, Mother, let me ask you, you lived for 80 years, what was the best, absolutely best time of your life? She said, without any doubt, the time at the front. Okay, now this woman had 4 children, 8 grandchildren, lived a good life with her husband, traveled, had good friends, still at 80 was enjoying her life thoroughly, in fact more or less until the end. She died age 100. And she said that it was absolutely the best time of my life. And when I asked her why, she said something very interesting. That's why I picked this picture of soldiers dancing at the front in the snow. She said, oh, because everyone was wonderful then. And she was not a very educated woman. She was pretty well read, but had seen a lot of theater and so on, but had not gone to the university and was not sophisticated, had a simple wisdom, everyday wisdom. And I think she was saying something very crucial, not about the others, but about herself, that it was a magic moment, a magical moment of full possibility back then. Now, this was very strong to me because it reminded me of my own generation. And then soon after, about the same time, I met a very interesting man. This is him at age 22 in 1943. And if you read this, I have been introduced in a Kolonaki house, a man writing in 44, to Natalia Mela, a relation of Alexi Lalas, the man on the left, who saw the trial of Alexi and Frank McCaskey in July 1943, German court-martial in Athens. When sentence of death was passed, she remembers seeing through streaming tears McCaskey, a hand in his pocket, looking superbly nonchalant, his expression betraying satisfied superiority, while Alexei was a defiant lion. He was 22, just sentenced to death. Well, being who they were, of course, both of them escaped 2 months later. And Alexei went on, and this is the picture, he went on to take charge of a flotilla of caiques in the Aegean, doing sabotage against German targets. McCaskey is on the right. I met Alexei here he is in his 60s, a charming man, very much a sort of Humphrey Bogart figure, drinker, smoker, bon vivant, womanizer, a couple of marriages, even more girlfriends and so on, and really a charming, charming man who has had a successful life in a way, very successful. He was a journalist and editor living outside of Greece, but he said something to me which struck me as driving even harder the point that my mother had made. He said, all my life has not been very interesting because after what I did during the war, how could I find anything interesting? This, to me, was something extraordinary, something that I could take at its face value, but something I could not in me accept as the lifetime's position. And mind you, this from a man who had lived an interesting and fulfilling life after that, but he was speaking of a deeper unhappiness. This brought to me again the themes that had I wanted to work with earlier, of the operation and the occupation, liberation, dictatorship, junta. And I went back also to and started reading about the occupation. And this is the similar 23 July 74 experience in October 44, the liberation of Athens, and my own experience of July 23rd, you know, also the pictures you saw earlier. By the way, look at this picture for a moment, and look at the next one again. Look at this quite closely, the people. And this one, do you see any difference? Can you mark the difference, yes?
No, if you can go back.
Okay, okay, you're cheating, but all right.
There's happier.
The flag?
No, there's flags here. There's a small flag here. Well, the resolution is not very good. But I was there that evening.
I was trying to find it.
Everyone was much younger. Here you see people in the 30s and 40s even, if you look closer. Here they're all in their 20s or late teens. And I think there was that characteristic, that the junta, not that the older people liked the junta, but the enthusiasm and the involvement in working against it and hoping that it goes away was something much stronger among the very young. Now, with this, I started to wonder again, what should I do? You know, why is this thing? I think, you know, people who are writers usually write out of their obsessions. And this was a subject that was obviously obsessing me, so I wanted to understand what I could do with it. And then suddenly what I'll show you now, I found later, about 10 years earlier, but I realized somehow what this research said, which I found read later, I had, as a personal reality, come to the same conclusion. This is a research, an important research conducted in 1989 to important American sociologists. If you want to read what it says, for the majority, okay, so they take 12 national events, a big sample of American citizens by different ages, ask them what's most important to them in the 20th century. What they realize is that events that happen to them between the ages of 13 and 25 are the primary events that influence their sense of the political. Especially if you see the following diagram, that is extraordinary how you can see it here. Here are two events, the Vietnam War, dotted line, and the World War I, black line. The importance it is given according to the age of the person asked. Go to 60, 64, down there, for example. Look at the importance of the Vietnam War. Look at the importance of the Second World War. Go to age 30, 34. The Vietnam War appears as a much more important event in the 20th century. The question was, what 20th century events are important? The Vietnam War seemed a much more important event than World War II. And this is a lot has to do with the imprinting on a generation. Of course, those things are not written on stone. They're not totally deterministic. They're not laws like the Pythagorean theorem. But still, they do tell us something, and it told me something about my experience, the experience of my generation. So I started to think in terms of occupation generations, where occupation is a situation where a state rules against constitutional order by force of arms, dissent is published by prison or death, and an occupation generation is not anyone who goes under it, but those whose formative years are lived wholly or in part in conditions of occupation. Now, the operative word here for my generation and the junta as we call it, the years of the dictatorship, as the time passed, was nostalgia. This is the difficult word, the wonderful ancient word, actually of all, not ancient word, all constituents, nostos, return, and argos, ponos, the pain of return. It's a wonderful word for it because it is not so much in the, it stresses the fact that it's not so much in the now. Nostalgia is in the now, but it's about wanting to go back. A sentimental longing or wistful attention for a period in the past, or something done or presented in order to evoke feelings of nostalgia, and both are there in my generation. Now, nostalgia can be a very dangerous thing for an operation, for an occupation generation. The minor peril is the idealization of the occupation, including the adoration of heroes and martyrs, real or imagined. Now, this part, the idealization, takes a very concrete form usually. You have the story, let's say, of the junta, resistance, dictatorship, democracy. The idealization transforms it, makes resistance appear as much stronger than it actually was, and more importantly, it creates in memory a strong causal connection between resistance and democracy. The junta collapsed because of the resistance. You see the same in accounts of the Second World War, occupation and liberty. Resistance existed, of course, but its role in the causality of bringing about the end of the occupation is overstressed. Now, that is already an idealization of the past. And while the main narrative of the occupation for most people, and this was the main narrative of the junta, as most people in Greece lived through the junta, the occupation, the junta, is a totally bad thing. The junta officers are bad guys, and poor Greeks are the poor guys, good guys, and we all want to get rid of it. But the way it is transformed in memory, the good guys engage in the resistance, all of them, or almost all of them. The aim of the resistance is totally clear, to oust the bad guys, ending the occupation and bringing liberation. By the way, that is fully true regarding the junta, not so true regarding the occupation, and resistance results in liberation. So the nostalgia transforms the memory, what I call nostalgia, and beware, occupation generation, nostalgia can be hazardous to narratives. Post-occupation's representations of the occupation, either internal, in memory, or external, in storytelling, as a rule suffer from either one or both of place, time, and ideas dominate plot and character, they take over them, or if they don't, and plot and character, or the diluted, the baser form of character called type, more stereotypical, obey the rules of melodrama, become very schematic. As a result, there are no good enough novels. Another reference to my psychiatrist friends, the good enough as in Winnicott's Good Enough Mother. There are no good enough novels, either of the occupation or the junta, by members of the respective occupation generation. And before anyone from the Greek subfaculty jumps up and says, "You are wrong," no. I'll say there are the examples that prove the rule. By the way, the expression, the exception that prove the rules, is the least understood among sometimes even very intelligent and educated persons expression that I know of. Because usually they speak of something, of a rule, blah, 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 blah. There's a counter-example, they say, ah, that's the exception that proves the rule. That would be ridiculous. If there's a counter-example to a law, the counter-example disproves it. And in that sense, there cannot be an exception that proves the rule. The exception that proves the rule is an exception, and it proves the rule because there is a special reason for which it is an exception. And this happens here, that there are good novels about the occupation, at least according to the canon. I'm not putting personal opinion here. Of course, there is the trilogy of Stratis Circas, most famously. Size in this little diagram here shows the extent to which they're acknowledged as great. There's Polyorkia by Alexandros Doxiadis, also another not so great, perhaps not so much accepted, but a great novel to me. Novella is Tadondia Exmilot, Petras by Kastalis. They are the exceptions that prove the rule. Why? Because in none of them the main narrative as I described it enters. They are not about the occupation. They are not about the main issue of the occupation. They are about the fighting between Greeks during the occupation. So although nominally they are occupation material, they are not about the occupation or the main conflict. They are with the occupiers. So then in the Minor Peril, there is also the adoration of heroes and martyrs, real or imagined. I'll go very fast here, though it's perhaps one of my favorite subjects. One real-life example, the Kitsos Maltesos, you may have heard that name. He was a young man at the time of the occupation, a student. At first, one of the leaders of Okne, the communist youth, then left it, became one of the leading figures in a national organization, and was assassinated, sentenced to death by his ex-comrades of Okne, and assassinated. Two of his two dearest friends, Rodis Rufos on the left and Theodoris Frankopoulos or Boulis Frankopoulos on the right, were fixated on his person. They're both wonderful people, wonderful writers, but for both of them, the rest of their lives revolved about the nostalgia and the memory of the lost friend at age 23. They were, I think, a year younger, so they were 22, he was 23. They both wrote books about it, Rufus 1, Frankopoulos 2. And in those books, which are very interesting books, you see them typically suffering from, based on a true story, plus nostalgia. And those are in the case where face-time plot, you remember all that, the magnet attracts here the subjects towards place-time. And here there's a particular form of distortion that they're heavy on place-time and ideas. And to speak about place-time and ideas, it's wonderful, but it's essay material. It's not storytelling material. Storytelling needs plot and character. So the major peril of nostalgia, though, to me, and I won't speak about this now, but if you want, we can about the discussion, because there are elements that may interest you, is emulation of the old story, not letting go of it in either active ways, such as through the perpetration of extreme acts, or the adoption of extreme worldviews, Manichaean politics or ideologies, or passively as in the difficulty to adapt to normal, i.e. not very interesting times. You remember that earlier I abandoned Metahunda, but now, having said what I have, I can talk about it again perhaps, and come back to Susan, as we call her, and give you a non-young man's answer to what is the interesting thing about her breakdown. That because Susan cannot overcome the standard profile of an occupation generation, or in different language, because she's maladapted for meaning, for finding meaning in life. How can we go beyond that now? Because that is really the main issue for my generation. A lot has been heard in modern Greece about the terrible troubles that the generation of Polytechneio has inflicted on Greece. Those are partly fair, partly unfair. You cannot generalize, of course, but here we are talking, generalizing in a way which I hope is interesting and not simplistic, because I'm not reducing individual cases to it, but speaking about an element that might have some energy as a symbol. How can we go beyond that? How can we transcend Metahunda? First of all, we have to accept that an occupation generation and the Junta generation, the Polytechneio generation, grew up inside a forming narrative that influenced directly or indirectly, explicitly or implicitly, its worldview. This worldview was fine then, but if it persists, and when it persists, can result, and often has resulted, in a maladaptation. The way it comes here is that place-time, that's the worst form of maladaptation, and talking now about life, not art, can take over plot. You can be living your life as if all your symbols and images are from another time, the action guided by that. Now, at the level of character and ideas, you have a host of problems. You have ennui and mal du siècle. I love those two French expressions used in English. They portray so well what they want to say. Cynicism, paranoia in character, immoralism, fanaticism, extremism in ideas. When you have the persistence of that. What the operative word here, to transcend nostalgia, is to mourn. And mourning is, the psychiatrists may tell us in the discussion, a very complex process. But what it means in the context in which I'm talking about is taking place-time and forgetting so much about place-time and moving the issues, first of all, to character, which is where those issues really should unfold as one grows up, and then moving on to plot, because life is plot, life is action, and taking into account the place-time, the new place-time, not the old one, character and ideas. This transposition is the necessity, but before that, the necessity of mourning is going beyond this story of the past, and the promise at the end of such a day, 23rd of July, for me and my generation, there will be days and days and days like this, with the realization that, no, the one, and let's live with that. Ending, I don't want to end on a black note. I want to tell you that there have been successful mourners of the 40s occupation generation, and those successful mourners of the 1940s occupation generation were people who had, I only present here just the names and the pictures of people who had been active during those years in the occupation, in the resistance, or in what was during the occupation called the resistance. And here this parenthesis is necessary, because often what we call during the occupation the resistance involved fighting among Greeks, which cannot necessarily be called resistance. So the people here were active during it, and then went on to conduct a very successful mourning, which means to conduct very successful lives totally unrelated to the past. A great archaeologist, Spiros Iacovidis, a great psychoanalyst, Anna Potamiano, a great architect, Kostis de Kavalas, a great sculptors, Natalia Melad. The latter three are alive and thriving and productive in their 90s. And lest I be accused that I only present persons who were active in the nationalist, or it might be called right-wing organizations. The same was true of the left, of course. Grand example, Yannis Xenakis. The scars on the left side of his face were formed during the Battle of Athens, December 1944. Cornelius Castoriadis, philosopher. Kandilis, a great architect. Aris Alexandrou, perhaps the man who has produced the greatest novel of that decade. But the same is true, of course, of the 70s. There are too many, I cannot mention the names, of successful mourners of the occupation generation. I should point out, of course, it's not just the famous who are successful. You don't have to have create as a grand word. You can be the most successful human being without having achieved public fame, but because they're more recognizable to you, or could be, I mentioned people who are better known for the work. One of the prime examples is Dionysius Avopoulos, tortured savagely during the junta and involved at the early years, first 2 years of the resistance, and then throughout in the resistance through the junta with his songs. Yorgos Pavlakis, one of the leaders of the student movement during the occupation of the University of Athens, now a major researcher in NIH in America, a major medical researcher. And two wonderful people. These are a couple, and this is how they look now. Aren't they amazing? Now, last year, Maria Kogino, Andreas Kouvlas, two of our most wonderful architects. You may have seen one of their works, the Museo Benakion Piraeus. Andreas was one of the leaders of the Polytechneio Rising. Maria, a young student then, still together, still happily married, still extremely creative, fully successful mourners. The last is a dear friend of mine to whom I would like also to dedicate this talk, Stavros Tsakirakis, the head of our cell during the occupation, savagely tortured, arrested, was crucified again and again during the junta. One of the leaders of the Polytechneio Rising has never in his life after that spoken about it, never referred to it, never made the resistance hero. A wonderful man, wonderful professor and scientist, a legal scholar, professor of constitutional law, and a brave man whose courage and moral qualities, I hope, give to me and to all of us who know him the best case of what people can learn undergoing difficult experiences, mourning them, surviving them, and going on to create other good things in their life. So, thank you all.